This is a made-up story meant to be fun. Before we start, please leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. It's always interesting to see how far these stories can go. In the fall of 1947, a truck that was supposed to deliver milk to the town of Winona, Missouri, in the southeastern corner of Shannon County, about 12 miles from the Arkansas border, didn't show up. The driver, a 43-year-old man named Horace Pell, had taken the same route every Thursday morning for 6 years, without any problems. He stopped at a remote farm owned by two men who were known locally as Virgil and EMTT Grants. The farm was at the end of a narrow dirt road that went through thick parts of the Mark Twain National Forest. The nearest neighbor was about 9 miles away. His wife called the Shannon County Sheriff's Department when Pell didn't come home by nightfall. The next morning, a search began. What investigators found would go mostly unreported for almost 20 years, hidden away in filing cabinets and marked with notes that made it look like the case had been handled with unusual care. It wasn't until 1965, when a junior archivist at the Missouri State Historical Society named Delmare Cutting started cataloging old county records, that some documents came to light that showed a much more disturbing picture than the official reports had shown. The Grants' farm was on about 80 acres of heavily wooded land, but only 15 acres were cleared for farming and grazing. The property had been in. The Grants family has owned the property since 1889, when their father, Silas Grants, bought it from a timber company that was selling off its assets after the timber boom ended. County deed records show that Silas paid $420 for the land, which was a small amount even back then. This was because the land was far away and the soil was not very good. The land was in a hollow that was surrounded by ridges of oak, hickory, and pine trees. There was a creek in the northwestern corner that was fed by a spring and had water all year. This stream would become important in later investigations because it provided a natural way to get rid of trash that would leave little trace. Everyone said that Silas Grants was a normal guy. He worked the land with some success, raised cattle, and mostly kept to himself. Census records from 1900 and 1910 show that he was a farmer, was widowed, and lived with his 2 adult sons. According to county death records, their mother, Martha Grants, died in 1895, as shown in the 1890 census. It said that the cause of death was problems that come up during childbirth. Silas never married again. Virgil and EMTT didn't go to school much. They learned how to farm and take care of animals by doing it on the property. The way Silas died in February 1921 was a little strange. The death certificate says that he fell from the barnoft and got hurt, which is what caused him to die 3 days later. Dr. Arthur Wendell, the local doctor who treated him, wrote in his notes that Silas was very sick. Bruises and bleeding inside that are typical of a fall. But Dr. Wendell also wrote a note in the margin of his personal journal, which was found later during the 1965 investigation that raised questions. The note said, "Patient had injuries consistent with a fall, but the pattern of bruising suggests a possible altercation. The 2 men say he fell while alone, with no witnesses. The patient couldn't speak clearly because of head trauma and died before he could make a clear statement." Dr. Wendell apparently chose not to pursue the matter further. In rural areas of that era, deaths from farm accidents were common, and questioning grieving family members without clear evidence required more resources than were typically available. Virgil and Emmett inherited the property jointly. They were then 28 and 31 years old, respectively. Neither had ever held employment outside the farm. Neither had courted or shown interest in marriage. They continued the operation their father had established, maintaining a small herd of dairy cattle and selling. They sold milk, butter, and sometimes vegetables to people in the area and merchants. In the early years, the brothers' reputation in the community was not very good. Most people who knew them said they were quiet, hard-working, and a little strange, but not in a way that made them very worried. They went to church services every few months, always late, and leaving right after the last hymn. They didn't talk much and seemed uncomfortable around crowds. Women in the community sometimes said that the brothers had strange habits or looked at people in a creepy way, but these comments were mostly seen as unfair judgments of men who were just shy or socially awkward. Interviews with surviving residents decades later paint a clearer picture of the brothers. Nain Prosser, who ran a general store in Winona in the 1930s and 1940s, remembered that the brothers came to town every 6 weeks or so to buy supplies. They always came together, never alone. They only spoke when they had to, giving a list of things they needed and paying in cash. Mrs. Prosser said that they never talked about the news, the weather, or other people like most customers do. She said they were there, but not really there, like they were going through the motions without really participating in the world around them. She also said they had a strange smell. It wasn't a bad smell, but it was something earthy and faintly metallic that stuck to their clothes. Another person, Terence Gulch, who worked as a farmhand for different properties in the area during the 1930s, said that during a particularly hard winter when jobs were hard to come by, he asked about work at the Grants' farm. Virgil, the older brother who usually dealt with outsiders, told him they didn't need help. Gulch kept talking about his situation, and Virgil's response was unforgettable. "We handle our own work. We don't need strangers on the property. You should look elsewhere." Gulch thought Virgil's refusal was too harsh. Most farmers, even those who weren't hiring at the time, would at least show some sympathy or suggest checking back in the spring. Virgil's response was cold and final. Gulch never went back to them. The brothers' isolation went beyond their interactions in town. They didn't have any friends, a social circle, or any community events besides going to church once in a while. They weren't members of the local farmers' cooperative, and they didn't go to the county fair. They were never seen at community gatherings or celebrations. For two men who lived and worked together every day, they seemed to live in a bubble separate from the world around them. This isolation wasn't necessarily suspicious on its own. Many rural families kept to themselves, but when combined with later events, it became suspicious. More ominous quality. Isolation provides privacy, and privacy can conceal many things. The discovery of Horace Pell's truck came on the second day of the search. It was found abandoned approximately 3 miles from the Grants' property, pulled off onto a narrow logging road that had been largely reclaimed by vegetation. The truck's engine was cold, the driver's side door stood open. Inside, investigators found Pell's jacket draped over the seat, his thermos of coffee still half full, and a clipboard with delivery receipts. Nothing seemed to be missing. There was no sign of a fight. The truck's keys were still in the ignition. Sheriff Dalton Pewett's official report said that the vehicle showed no signs of mechanical failure that would explain why Pell had stopped where he did. The logging road didn't lead anywhere in particular. It ended about half a mile further into the forest at an old timber staging area that hadn't been used in over a decade. A search party. 9 men spent the next 3 days searching the area around the truck and along the route to the Grants' farm. They found nothing. No clothes, no personal items, and no sign of where Horace Pell might have gone. On the 4th day, Sheriff Pewett and 2 deputies drove to the Grants' property to question the brothers. This visit is documented in a handwritten log that Delmare Coding found in a box marked Miscellaneous Rural Cases 1945 to 1950. The log entry was dated October 23rd. Deputy Roscoe Talmadge wrote it in 1947. Part of it says, "Arrived Grants' farm at about 10:15 a.m. The property looks well kept. The outbuildings are in good shape. Virgil Grants met us at the gate. He looked nervous but was helpful. He said they hadn't seen Pell or his truck. As usual, the last delivery was on Thursday. During the interview, EMTT Grant stayed in the house. Virgil asked us to look at the property. At that time, we said no. There is no good reason to search. Left 11 by noon. 5 days later, Sheriff Pwitt's investigation was over. The official conclusion was that Horace Pell probably had a medical problem while driving, left his car in a daze, and wandered into the woods where he either died from the weather or was attacked by an animal. They never found his body. The case was still open, but nothing was happening with it. Mrs. Pell got a small amount of money from the dairy company's insurance policy. Life went on in Shannon County. The Grant brothers kept running their dairy business. Another driver, a younger man named Curtis Lowe, took over the deliveries. He had no problems with the route. It's not the fact that Horace Pell went missing that makes this case so interesting. It's what Delmar Ketting found out 18 years later while working on his master's thesis about rural economies in southern Missouri. He was going through county records and noticed a pattern. Shannon County had 14 events between 1928 and 1947, cases of missing people. This number wasn't anything special on its own. The county was more than 1,000 square miles of rough land, most of which was uninhabited forest. There were many reasons why people went missing. They got lost while hunting and wandered off. They fell into old mine shafts that were no longer in use. They just made the choice to leave without telling anyone. The clustering is what caught Kitting's eye. 9 of those 14 cases happened within 12 miles of Grant's farm. To be more specific, 7 of. The 9 people who are missing had some kind of record of being connected to the Grants brothers, either as customers, delivery people, or neighbors. In March 1965, Coating sent a series of notes about his findings to his thesis advisor, Professor Wendell Marsh. Professor Marsh called the Missouri State Police because he was worried about what this meant. A casual investigation began, but by this time, both Virgil and EMTT. Grants had passed away. Virgil died in 1959 from what was said to be complications from pneumonia. In 1962, EMTT had a cerebral hemorrhage while working in the barn. In 1963, the county sold the land for back taxes. A logging company then bought it and clear-cut most of the forested areas, leaving the buildings behind. When investigators went to the site in April 1965, they saw that the main house had partially fallen down, the barn roof had caved in, and most of the outbuildings were covered in plants. There was nothing of evidentiary value found in the other buildings that were left. Time and decay had either taken away or destroyed any secrets the property may have had. Cutting's 9 disappearances make up a disturbing timeline that lasts for almost 20 years. The dangers of living in the country in early 20th century Missouri could explain each case on its own. When looked at as a pattern, they point to something much more planned and evil. The first time was in January 1928, when a 42-year-old traveling salesman named Jasper Cobb didn't show up at his scheduled, staying in Eminence after seeing a few farms in the area, such as the Grants. Cobb sold household goods and tools for farming. He went through Shannon, Carter, and Reynolds counties on a regular route. His account books, which he got back from his last place of residence, showed that he had sold things at 3 farms on January 14, 1928. He had planned to visit 2 more, including the Grants property, before reaching Eminence by nightfall. He didn't show up. After his brother in St. Lewis said he was missing, but no sign of Cobb, his wagon, or his horse was ever found. The sheriff's report from the area, which was filed on January 23, 1928, said that Cobb probably had bad luck on a deserted road and may have been robbed or hurt. The case was never closed. A note in Cobb's account books that investigators found in 1965 makes it important in retrospect. Cobb had written on the January 14th page, Grant's brothers, 2 milk buckets, 1 harness repair kit, total, $8.50. Below this, in what looked like a quick scroll, he had written, Strange men. Place feels wrong. The second disappearance happened in August 1932. The Grants brothers hired a 37-year-old itinerant worker named Fletcher Drum to help with the haying. Drum was a temporary worker who moved from farm to farm looking for work during the busy season. He had been working on the Grants' property for about 3 weeks when he disappeared. At the time, local officials thought Drum had. They just left without saying goodbye, which is common for temporary workers who followed the harvest seasons and often left without saying goodbye. An interview with the owner of a boarding house in Winona in 1966, on the other hand, gave more information. Esther Kimball, the owner, said that Drum had been staying at her place and had already paid for 2 weeks' worth of room. Mrs. Kymel kept his things when he didn't come back to get them after 2 weeks. His things for 6 months before getting rid of them. One of the things he had was a letter that Drum had started but never finished. Mrs. Kimmel looked at it for a second before throwing it away, and one phrase stuck in her mind. These brothers pay fairly, but something about them makes my skin crawl. Mrs. Kimball told investigators this in 1932, when they asked her about Drum for a short time, but they thought it was just the impression of a nervous traveler, seen decades later through. In light of the subsequent disappearances, the remark appears more prophetic than paranoid. The third case happened in April 1935 and involved a woman named Opal Stillwater, who was 54 years old and ran a small egg and poultry business from her home about 8 miles from the Grants' farm. Mrs. Stillwater was a widow who sold chickens, eggs, and sometimes ducks to farms and homes in the area. People last saw her on April 17, 1935, when she was loading a wagon with a lot of crates of chickens to take them somewhere. That day, she passed by the Grants' property on her way. A search began when she didn't come home by nightfall. About 3 miles from the Grants' farm, her wagon and horse were found on the main road. The horse was still in its harness and stood still as if it were waiting. There was nothing in the wagon. Mrs. Stillwater's chickens, delivery records, and coin purse were all missing. They never found Mrs. Stillwater. The sheriff's investigation found that she had probably been the victim of robbery, maybe by passing vagrants who took the chickens and money and ran away. There were never any suspects found. When asked, the Grants brothers said that Mrs. Stillwater had come to their farm that morning, dropped off 6 chickens as planned, been paid $3, and left without any problems. They didn't know what might have happened to her after that. They were accepted. A few years later, a friend of Mrs. Stillwater told police that she had said she was uncomfortable dealing with the Grants brothers, but she couldn't say why. But business was business, and she needed the money. Even though she didn't want to, she went to their farm. The pattern kept going, but the intervals changed. The connection to the Grants' property was always the same, though. A 45-year-old land surveyor named Quentin Reeves went missing in March 1938, while he was working on a property assessment in the area. The county hired Reeves to resurvey several pieces of land so that they could get new tax assessments. His job took him to a number of places, such as the Grants' farm. Reeves had done surveys of 6 properties and was going to survey Grants' land on March 18th, according to his field notes that were found in his office after he went missing. He wrote down something strange in his notes from March 17th. Grant's brothers didn't want to let the survey happen. Virgil said that an updated assessment wasn't needed, but he pointed out that several outbuildings weren't listed in the county's current records. He will come back tomorrow with the sheriff. Permission if needed. Reeves never sent in a report about the extra buildings. On March 18th, he vanished. They never found his surveying tools, which included an expensive transit theolite. The sheriff's investigation, which was made harder by the lack of evidence, came to the conclusion that Reeves probably had an accident in the rough terrain. When asked, the Grants brothers said that Reeves had come to their property for a short time and told them they didn't want to take part in the reassessment. Had gone. They said there was no conflict. There was no evidence that went against what they said. The survey of their property was never finished, and their tax bill was still based on the 1920 value. A 23-year-old man named Lel Parch, who worked on and off for several local farms, including the Grange, disappeared in November 1940 after saying he was going to the Grants' property to collect wages owed to him. Parch had worked for the brothers on and off for almost 2 years, helping with seasonal tasks when his work was needed. People said he was a dependable worker, but they also said he was a little slow. After 3 days without him coming back to his room, his landlady reported him missing. She told the sheriff that Parch had said that the Grants brothers owed him almost $20 for work he had done for them in the last month, and that he planned to collect it before taking a job on a farm in Reynolds County for the winter. Virgil told the sheriff that Parch had come to the Grants' property when he asked. He got his pay, which was all in cash, and then he left on foot to go back to town. That November afternoon, no one else saw Lel Parch after he walked down the road toward the Grants' farm. Searchers went over the road between the farm and town, but they didn't find anything. She thought the landlords were to blame for his disappearance, but she had no proof. The case that got the most attention at the time was about a middle-aged couple named Dwight and Mavis Kelso, who were 48 and 46 years old at the time, went missing in June 1942. People in the area knew the Kelsos very well. Dwight ran a small sawmill, and Mavis was involved in the church in the area. They were responsible, well-respected citizens, not people who were just passing through or living alone, whose absence might go unnoticed or be easily explained. The Kelsos left their home on June 14, 1942, around mid-morning. They told their neighbors they were going to run errands and buy milk from a few local farms, including the Grants' property, where they often bought milk and butter. Neighbors called the police when they hadn't come back by nightfall. There was an immediate search. The Kelsos' 1938 Ford sedan was found the next morning near Current River, which is about 8 miles from the Grants' farm. It was parked on a road that is not often used, but is sometimes used by fishermen. The doors were open. The keys were in the car's ignition. The investigators found the Kelsos' grocery shopping from earlier in the day inside, with a few pounds of butter. A handwritten receipt found in Mavis Kelso's purse proved that she had bought the butter from the Grants brothers. Dwight's wallet, which had $42 in it, and Mavis's jewelry, which included her wedding ring and a pearl necklace, were also in the car. It didn't look like anything had been stolen. Many local newspapers wrote about the Kelsos' disappearance, and a coordinated search involving sheriff's deputies from several counties, state police, and a lot of the people who helped. The river was dragged. The woods around were searched. They brought in bloodhounds. There was never any sign of the couple. The investigation went on for 6 weeks, but was stopped without finding a solution. The police asked the Grant brothers a lot of questions. Their story stayed the same. The Kelsos went to their farm in the middle of the afternoon, bought milk and butter, talked for a short time about the weather and the war effort, and then left. Virgil and EMTT seemed to be working together and said they were worried about the couple who was missing. Their behavior and words didn't show that they were involved. It didn't make sense that the couple would have driven to the place where the car was found because it wasn't on any logical route from the Grants' farm to the Kelso home. There was a theory that they had been followed from the Grants' property and forced off the road, but there was no proof of this. Another idea said that they had stopped at the river for some reason and were then attacked by people they didn't know. But no again. There was proof of robbery or random violence. Investigators officially agreed that the couple had planned to stop at the river, maybe to enjoy the afternoon, but something bad happened. Maybe they drowned. Even though the river was searched thoroughly and neither body was ever found, this explanation was never good enough for people who knew the couple, but it stayed the official conclusion until someone proved it wrong. In August 1944, an old man named Clifton Yates, 71, was last seen walking toward the brothers' property. He sometimes helped them with veterinary issues with their cattle. Yates was a retired friar and livestock trader who knew a lot about taking care of animals. He had been working with the Grants brothers for a few years, going to their farm every few months to check on the health of their herd and give them advice on breeding and care. Yates told his neighbors on August 9, 1944, that he was going to the Grants' farm because Virgil had told them that one of their cows was having trouble giving birth. Yates walked about 2 miles from his boarding house to the property. He never came back. His landlord waited until the next morning to call his neighbors, who then set up a search. When the searchers got to Grant's farm, Virgil told them that Yates had come, looked at the cow, given advice, taken $5 for his services, and then left. Virgil said that the cow was in the middle of the afternoon, had successfully given birth with Yates's help. There was no sign of Yates along the way from the Grants' farm to his house. They never found his body. The police thought it was an accident because Yates was old and might have had a heart attack while walking and gotten lost in the woods before collapsing. His landlord didn't believe him, saying that Yates, though old, was in good health and knows every road and path in the area. He thought Yates had never left the Grants' property alive, but he had no proof and no way to follow up on it. The last cases that Horace Pell worked on were in 1946, when 2 different people went missing after having documented interactions with the Grants brothers. In March of that year, a drifter named Silas Crump, who was thought to be in his 50s but whose age was not known, was seen in Winona looking for work. A number of people told him to. Farms on the outskirts where seasonal work might be available. People last saw Crump walking south on the road that went by the Grants' house. No one ever heard from him again. Because he was a transient with no family ties in the area, there wasn't much of an investigation into his disappearance. The second case that year was about a 62-year-old widow named Hester Bondant, who sold canned vegetables, jellies, pickles, and preserved foods from her small farm. Mrs. Bondant made regular visits to farms and homes in the area, including the Grants' property. Land. She set out on her usual route in November 1946 with her wagon full of jars of preserves. She successfully visited 3 farms, and the Grants' property was supposed to be her 4th stop. A search began when she didn't come home by the evening. They found her wagon on the side of the road about a mile from the Grants' farm. The horse was gone, as were all of Mrs. Bondurant's preserves and her cash box, which usually held all of her money, gathered during her rounds. They never found Mrs. Bondurant. The working theory was that she had been robbed, but it was strange that the thief would take preserves and a horse but leave the wagon. The Grants brothers said that they had been waiting for Mrs. Bondant to come, but she never did. They said that she might have changed her route or decided to go home for some reason. The investigation came to an end without any clear results. Local authorities had looked into each case to different degrees, but there was never a clear answer. In most cases, the official story was that the person had either chosen to leave the area or had an accident in the woods. At that time, Shannon County was far away, had a lot of trees, and few people lived there. There weren't many resources for law enforcement. A lot of the time, sheriff's deputies worked in areas that were hundreds of square miles. It was hard to do thorough investigations even when things were going well, and there was never any direct proof that. The Grants brothers were to blame for the disappearances. They were asked questions in a number of the cases, but their answers were always the same. They had only seen the person for a short time, either to do business or to visit. The person was gone. They didn't know anything else. There were never any bodies found. No one who saw anything strange said anything. The brothers kept doing what they always did, living quietly and being known as strange but harmless men who kept to themselves. Professor Marsh's 1965 inquiry prompted a more thorough investigation. Of the records that are available, one document stood out in particular, a diary that belonged to a woman named Clementine Rohr. She lived about 4 miles from the Grants' farm until she died in 1956. Her family gave the diary to the County Historical Society. Clementine talked about the Grants brothers from time to time over the course of almost 20 years. Most of the entries were boring. She bought milk from them from time to time. She saw them at church. She wrote down when smoke was, could be seen from their chimney. But a few entries really stood out. In September 1932, she wrote, "Saw the Grants men moving something wrapped in canvas from the barn to the root cellar after dark. Odd hour for such work." In April 1938, she noted, "Strong smell of lime coming from Grant's property when wind is from the east. Can't imagine what they're doing with so much lime." And in November 1944, she recorded EMTT Grants at church today. Looked unwell, hands shaking badly. Virgil was not with him. Haven't. It's been months since I've seen Virgil. Some people say he's sick but won't see a doctor. These observations, while suggestive, proved nothing. Lime was commonly used on farms for a variety of reasons. Moving things at night was unusual, but not necessarily illegal. Illness explained Virgil's absence. However, when combined with the pattern of disappearances, they created a picture that troubled investigators. Additional interviews were conducted with surviving residents who had known the brothers. Anne, an elderly woman named Bones Thatcher, remembered that her late husband had warned her not to go near the Grants' property. When asked why, she said he had told her the brothers weren't right and that respectable people stayed away from that place. She couldn't remember any specific incident that made him say this, but it was understood in their household that the Grants' farm was somewhere to avoid. Another person who testified was Calvin Prather, who had delivered mail in the area during the 1940s. Prather said that when he brought mail to the Grants' property, he often noticed a strange smell around the barn and root cellar. He said it smelled sour and meaty, like when an animal dies in a closed space and isn't found for a while. He told the brothers about this once, suggesting they might have a dead rat or possum somewhere, but they assured him everything was fine, and that the smell was from bone meal they used for fertilizer. Thayer didn't think much of it at the time. Bone meal did smell bad, but years later he wondered if something else might have caused the smell. The investigation also found a strange event from 1951, 4 years after Horace Pell went missing. A state wildlife officer named Amos Greer was surveying deer populations in the Mark Twain National Forest and happened to pass by the Grants' property. While walking through a wooded area next to their land, he found what looked like a small, unmarked, and unconsecrated burial ground. There were 5 distinct depressions in the earth, about the size of graves, arranged in 2 rows. The depressions were old. Vegetation had grown over them, but the outline was still visible. Greer told the county sheriff about this and marked the location on a map. Sheriff Puitt, who had also looked into the Pell case, went to the site. He wrote in his report on August 12, 1951, that the depressions were on property that technically belonged to the Granges, though in a section far removed from their active farmland. When questioned, Virgil Grants explained that the site was an old family cemetery where their grandparents and other relatives had been buried in the late 1800s. He provided no documentation to support this claim, and no headstones or markers had ever been placed. Sheriff Pruitt accepted the explanation. The matter was dropped. Years later, when this report was reviewed as part of the 1965 inquiry, several inconsistencies. First, according to county death records, the Grants' grandparents and known family members were buried in the municipal cemetery in Winona, not on the property. Second, the depressions were marked on Greer's map as being in a part of the forest that would have been very hard to get to in the 1800s, when the area was even more densely wooded than it is now. Third, and maybe most importantly, when Wildlife Officer Greer was interviewed in 1965, he said that the depressions he observed had not appeared particularly old to him. The soil, though settled and overgrown, had a composition that suggested disturbance within the previous 2 or 3 decades, not 70 or 80 years earlier, as the Grants' explanation would require. Greer admitted he was not an expert in such matters, but he had spent enough time in the woods to recognize the difference between recent and ancient ground disturbance. No formal excavation of the site was ever authorized. By 1965, both brothers were deceased. The property had changed. Hands and the legal problems of digging up possible graves without clear proof of wrongdoing were huge. The state police investigation ended with a summary that acknowledged the strange pattern of disappearances and the circumstantial evidence that suggested the Grants brothers may have been to blame. But it also noted the lack of concrete proof. The findings were written down and filed. The case was not officially reopened. The families of the missing were not formally told of the inquiry's conclusions as those. The conclusions were at best guesswork. Delmary Cutting finished his thesis, which had a chapter on the disappearances, but he chose not to name the Grants brothers at the request of his advisor, calling them only 2 local farmers. The thesis was submitted in May 1966 and kept in the university library, where it was mostly unread for decades. One of the more disturbing pieces of evidence found during the 1965 inquiry was a set of financial records that were subpoenaed from the Shannon County Bank, where the Grants brothers kept an account. Bank where the Grants brothers had an account. An analysis of their deposits and withdrawals showed an interesting pattern. From 1928 to 1947, the brothers made regular cash deposits that didn't seem to match the income that a small dairy farm like theirs would make. According to agricultural economists who were consulted during the investigation, a farm with 20 head of cattle producing milk for local sale might reasonably make between $800 and $1,200 a year at that time, accounting for changes in market prices and production. The Grants brothers' bank records, on the other hand, showed that they made cash deposits of between $2,000 and $4,000 each year. When asked about this difference, bank officials said that the brothers often deposited cash in small amounts, like $20 or $30 at a time, instead of larger, less frequent amounts, which is what you would expect from someone selling agricultural products. The source of this extra income was never documented. The brothers paid their taxes based on what they said their farm made. There was no evidence of any other business or source of income. An accountant who looked over the records suggested a few possible explanations. The brothers might have been involved in bootlegging during Prohibition. They might have sold timber from their property without reporting it. They might have had some kind of barter economy that sometimes turned into cash. Or they might have inherited money that they deposited slowly to avoid drawing attention to it. There were good reasons for each explanation, but the timing of the increased deposits was very close to the years when people went missing. This connection didn't prove anything, but it made an already suspicious situation even more so. If the brothers were responsible for the disappearances, what could have motivated them? Robbery didn't seem likely in most cases because the missing people weren't wealthy. Some of them were itinerant workers or modest tradespeople. Even the few who were wealthy were still missing. Who might have carried a lot of cash would not explain the brothers' steady income. Some investigators thought that the brothers might have been involved in some kind of body trade practices that, while rare, were not unheard of in isolated rural areas at that time. Medical schools and research facilities sometimes paid for cadavers, and dishonest people had been known to take advantage of this market. However, there was never any proof that the Grants brothers were involved in any of this found. Professor Marsh proposed another theory, that the brothers may have experienced a shared condition characterized by harmful impulses. Marsh consulted Dr. Leonard Vance, a psychiatrist at Washington University in St. Louis who specializes in criminal psychology. Dr. Vance examined the available information and provided an initial evaluation, noting that instances of shared disorders, where disturbing patterns are transmitted between individuals, have been documented in psychiatric literature. Isolated individuals, particularly siblings residing in close proximity without regular social interaction, may develop and reinforce aberrant thought patterns. If one brother exhibits certain tendencies, the other may adopt and endorse those tendencies, thereby creating a shared reality in which their actions are perceived as justified or necessary. Dr. Vance cautioned that this assertion is purely speculative, lacking direct examination or more detailed evidence, yet he acknowledged that the circumstances align with this hypothesis. A certain profile. The Grants' farm was isolated. The brothers didn't have many friends outside of the farm. They were said to act strangely in social situations, and the same things kept happening for almost 20 years, all of which pointed to a very dysfunctional situation. In October 1966, a final attempt was made to gather more information. A team of investigators went back to the old Grants' property, which had mostly been stripped of timber and was being divided into smaller parcels for sale. Using the map that Wildlife Officer Amos Greer gave them, they found the spot where the Grail-like depressions had been seen in 1951. The area had changed a lot since then. Logging operations had taken away a lot of the tree cover, and heavy machinery had disturbed the ground. The investigators brought in a geoethicist who used ground-penetrating radar to scan the area. The results were inconclusive. The radar picked up several anomalies that could be explained by disturbed earth, but they could also be explained by tree stumps, rocks, or other natural features. Without digging, it was impossible to tell what was going on. Formations, or other natural features. Without excavation, no determination could be made. A request to excavate was submitted to the county prosecutor's office. After reviewing the evidence, the prosecutor declined to authorize it. His reasoning, documented in a memo dated November 18, 1966, was that the evidence was entirely circumstantial. The individuals suspected were deceased and could not be prosecuted, and the potential distress to families if remains were found would not be balanced by any practical legal. The investigation was officially over. Over the next few years, the Grants' farm, or what was left of it, changed hands several more times. The United States Forest Service eventually bought the land and added it to the Mark Twain National Forest. The buildings that used to be on the property fell down completely and were taken over by plants. By the 1980s, there was no sign of the farm where Virgil and EMTT Grants had lived and worked for more than 40 years. Hikers sometimes passed through the area without knowing its history. The narrow dirt road that once led to the property is now barely visible, overgrown, and impassable by vehicle. In 2003, a group of recreational metal detector enthusiasts obtained permission to search portions of the former Grants' property for historical artifacts. Among the items they recovered were several old tools, pieces of farm equipment, and numerous metal buttons and buckles of the type used in clothing from the early 20th century. One of the detectorists, A. Marlene Hickson, a retired teacher, later said that the number of buttons and buckles seemed unusually high for a property occupied by only 2 men. Most were found near where the barn used to be and in an area next to the old root cellar. Hickson, who was interested in local history, researched the property and learned about its connection to the missing persons cases. She gave the items she found to the Shannon County Historical Society, along with a detailed map showing where each item was found. The Historical Society made a list of the items and put them in storage. There was no further investigation. The question of what really happened on the Grants farm between 1928 and 1947 is still unanswered. The most conservative interpretation is that the pattern of disappearances was coincidental, that the brothers were just unlucky enough to have lived in an area where many people went missing for unrelated reasons, and that the circumstantial evidence pointing toward their involvement was the result of confirmation bias and hindsight. This interpretation is not unreasonable. Rural areas in that era were dangerous. People did disappear. The absence of bodies, the lack of witnesses, and the absence of any direct physical evidence linking the brothers to any wrongdoing all support the possibility of innocence. However, the cumulative weight of circumstantial evidence presents a different picture. 9 people with documented connections to the Grants brothers disappeared over a 19-year period within a limited geographic area. Financial records indicate unaccounted income. Numerous witnesses reported peculiar odors and behaviors. A suspected burial site was identified on their property. The brothers' conduct and lifestyle implied significant social dysfunction. Although none of these facts individually serve as conclusive evidence, collectively they establish a compelling pattern that is challenging to disregard. One particularly disconcerting testimony originates from a 1967 interview with Virgil Ashton, who had been employed as a traveling veterinarian in the area in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Ashton, who was then in his 70s, remembered being called to the Grants farm twice to treat cattle. Both times, he found the experience very uncomfortable. The brothers were polite enough, he said, but there was something about the way they watched him work, the way they stood too close, and the way they seemed to talk to each other without speaking. More disturbing was what he saw in the barn during his second visit in 1941. While treating a cow for mastitis, Ashton noticed fresh staining on the wooden floor near the back wall. Dark patches that looked like they had been scrubbed, but not completely cleaned. When he asked about it, Virgil explained they had butchered a pig recently and hadn't finished cleaning up. Ashton accepted the explanation at the time, but something about it bothered him. The stains didn't look like pig blood to him. They were in the wrong location, and there was no evidence of recent butchering, no hanging carcass, no scraps, no smell of fresh pork. It wasn't until decades later that he learned about the missing persons cases and began to wonder what those stains really meant. The official records end in 1966 when the state police inquiry ended, but the story of the Grants brothers has lived on in the oral history of Shannon County. Older people still tell stories about the strange men who lived in the woods and sold milk, but might have been involved in something else. These stories have become more like folklore over the years, with each retelling adding to and distorting the original. Some versions include details that are clearly false, such as claims that dozens of people went missing, or that the brothers engaged in extreme practices or dark rituals. It becomes harder and harder to tell what's true and what's not, as witnesses die and memories fade. What can be said with certainty is limited but important. Virgil and Emmet Grants lived alone for over 40 years on a remote farm in Shannon County, Missouri. During that time, at least 9 people with documented ties to them went missing without a trace. No bodies were ever found, and no one was ever charged with a crime. The brothers died, the farm fell apart, and the forest took back the land. The truths that existed in that place died with the men who kept them. A researcher at the Missouri State Archives found one last document worth noting in 2008. It is a letter from March 1959 written by Virgil writes to Father Cornelius Dempsey, a parish priest in Winona. The letter was found in Father Dempsey's personal papers after he died in 1962 and was later given to the archives. The letter is short and written in a shaky hand, which suggests that Virgil's health was getting worse. It says, "Father, I write this knowing my time grows short. I can't tell you what has been bothering me because it's too much for any man to forgive. Please just pray for my brother and me and for the people who came to our house and stayed. We did what we thought was right. We weren't bad people. We were just practical in tough times. God will decide if we were right. I won't disagree with his decision." There was no response to the letter. Father Dempsey kept it with his papers, but he didn't do anything about it. We don't know if he thought Virgil's strange confession had to do with the missing persons cases or something else. The priest never talked about it in public. In 2008, when the letter was finally found and brought to the attention of local authorities, everyone involved was already dead. The letter was put into a file and organized. The Grant's brother story makes us think about how many cases in the early 1900s may have gone uninvestigated or unsolved because there weren't enough resources or people were too busy with other things. It also makes us think about how law enforcement works in rural areas and how isolated people can be. In the 1930s and 1940s, Shannon County was a place far away from the worries of state or federal officials. The people who lived there took care of their own business, kept their own safe, and sometimes ignored things that seemed wrong because it was hard to confront them, and there wasn't much proof. Whether Virgil and EMTT Grants were to blame, whether they did it for money or because they had to, or some combination of the two, and whether the grave-like depressions in the forest held the bodies of Horace Pell, Opal Stillwater, Fletcher Drum, and the others. There will never be a clear answer to these questions. The structures that used to be on that property have rotted away, along with the evidence. The scars in the ground have healed and the forest has grown back. People who might have known are no longer here. What we have left is a story that is half written down and half whispered about two brothers who lived at the end of a dirt road in the Missouri woods. They sold milk to their neighbors, kept to themselves, and may have had secrets that were too dark to tell. The milk was brought, people paid the money and didn't ask too many questions. Something happened in those quiet woods and on that lonely farm that the rest of the world either didn't see or didn't want to believe. When the wind blows through the Mark Twain National Forest just right on warm summer nights, some local hikers say they feel strange things in certain places. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched, and the smell of something bad coming from the wind. These reports are. It's easy to write off as imagination, thanks to the power of suggestion. But they keep going. The forest remembers what happened in its clearings and hollows, even if the people who lived there have forgotten. The earth keeps its secrets, quiet and patient, until someone digs deep enough to find the truth. The story of Virgil and Emmett Grants will always be a shadow over Shannon County, a warning about what can grow in isolation, and a reminder that not all. Transactions aren't always as easy as they seem. They sold milk, yes, but the question that has haunted the case since Delmar Kidding first asked it in 1965 is this: what else did they sell, and to whom? Time and nature have taken back the Grants' farm, but the answers are buried somewhere in those woods, under the leaves and moss and the slow passage of time. For over 70 years they have been waiting in silence for someone to come. Brave or stupid enough to ask the right questions and look in the right places. People need to decide for themselves if those answers should be disturbed and if bringing them to light would do anything other than satisfy curiosity. Some mysteries are solved, some are left alone, and some may be meant to stay hidden, because the truth they hold is too heavy for the world to handle. The story of the Grants brothers could be one of these mysteries. We tell the tale, we look at the proof, we guess and make up stories. But in the end, we are still at the edge of the forest, looking into shadows we can't see and hearing whispers we can't quite hear. There is no longer a road on any map that goes to the Grants' farm. The buildings have fallen into the ground. The people who knew them are no longer alive. But the story lives on, passed down from person to person who heard it from someone who was there. And in that persistence, there is a kind of truth, even if it isn't the truth we want. We know that something happened in those woods between 1928 and 1947. We know that people went to that farm and never came back. Virgil and EMTT Grants lived and died with knowledge they never told anyone. We may never know what that knowledge was, but maybe just knowing that it exists and is buried somewhere in the forest floor of Shannon County is enough. Or maybe it should be enough. There are some doors that can't be closed once they are open. Some questions that were asked before need answers that we aren't ready to hear. The story. The Grants brothers' door has been knocked on many times over the years, but it has never fully opened. And sometimes the people who knocked the hardest wished they hadn't done it.